All right, today we're jumping into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the Civil War. It was the single bloodiest conflict the nation has ever seen. And what's really amazing is that the footage you're seeing here, well, it's all based on actual historical photographs, brought back to life with incredible clarity. Okay, let's get into it.
To really wrap your head around the scale of this war, you have to start with this number, 620,000. That's how many Americans are estimated to have died. Now, to put that into perspective for you, that was about 2% of the entire U.S. population back then. Just imagine, this was a war that touched literally every single community and would change the country forever.
So how on earth did it come to this? Well, it all started with an election that basically pushed a country, already at its breaking point, right over the edge.
What's just staggering when you look at this is the sheer speed of how fast everything fell apart. So, in November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. His big thing? No expansion of slavery into new territories. Well, the southern states saw the writing on the wall. They were terrified he'd eventually try to abolish it everywhere, so they didn't even wait. By February, 7 states had already left the Union. And then, on April 12, 1861, the first shots are fired. The war was on.
You have to understand that at the very beginning, the two sides were fighting for fundamentally different reasons. For the Union, for Lincoln, the number one goal was just to hold the country together, to prove that this whole experiment in democracy wouldn't just collapse. But for the Confederacy, it was about two things: creating their own independent country and, at the absolute heart of it all, protecting the institution of slavery.
You know, both sides went into this thinking it would be a short, glorious, decisive little war. Boy, were they wrong. The very first major battle delivered a reality check so brutal it shattered every illusion they had.
This just perfectly captures the mood, doesn't it? I mean, can you even imagine? Before the first Battle of Bull Run, people from Washington, D.C. literally packed picnic baskets, got in their carriages, and rode out to watch the battle like it was some kind of sporting event. They truly expected to watch the Union Army just roll over the rebels and be back in the city for supper.
Yeah, that is not what happened. The Confederates, led by guys like General Thomas Jackson, who earned his famous nickname Stonewall right here, they held their ground and completely turned the tables. The Union attack just crumbled. It turned into a full-blown panicked retreat, and those same roads the picnickers used to get there, they were now jammed with soldiers running for their lives. Everyone realized, in that moment, this war was going to be long, and it was going to be unbelievably bloody.
So for more than a year, the war just raged on, with these horrific losses. But then, a battle in the fall of 1862 would become the single bloodiest day in American history. And more than that, it would completely change what the war was even about. The fighting at the Battle of Antietam was it's hard to even describe how brutal it was. There was this one spot, a sunken country road, where Confederates held a defensive line for hours. The fighting was so close, so intense, that by the time it was over, the road was literally filled with the bodies of the dead and wounded. It became known as Bloody Lane, a perfect, gruesome symbol for the horror of the war.
And this is the number that defines that day: 22,000. That's how many men were killed, wounded, or went missing in a single day of fighting. Let that sink in. To this day, it is still the bloodiest day in the history of the United States.
So even though the battle itself was kind of a draw, the Confederates were forced to retreat. And that gave Lincoln the opening, the strategic victory he desperately needed. 5 days later, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now you gotta understand, this was a huge moment. It was a very calculated strategic military move. It didn't actually free all the slaves right away. It only applied to the states that were in rebellion, places the Union didn't even control yet.
But oh my gosh, the impact was huge. It completely transformed the conflict. It wasn't just a political fight to keep the country together anymore. It was now a moral crusade to end slavery. This also had a massive international effect. It basically made it impossible for countries like Britain and France to support the Confederacy. And crucially, it opened the door for almost 200,000 black men to join the Union Army and fight for their own freedom.
This new purpose really lit a fire under the Union cause. And in July of 1863, two massive victories, happening hundreds of miles apart, would turn the tide of the war for good.
First, let's go to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. After 2 brutal days of fighting, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to risk it all on one giant, desperate frontal assault called Pickett's Charge. It was an absolute catastrophe. Just look at these numbers. They're just staggering. The Confederate Army was shattered, losing over a third of its men. They would never, ever again be strong enough to invade the North.
And get this, at the exact same time, way out west, General Ulysses S. Grant finally captured the fortress city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. This was huge because it gave the Union total control of the Mississippi River, literally slicing the Confederacy in half. This 1-2 punch of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it was the beginning of the end. It wasn't a question of if the Union would win anymore, just a matter of when.
So now Grant is put in charge of all the Union armies, and the whole strategy of the war changes. He understood that it wasn't enough to just beat the enemy's armies on the battlefield. He had to wage what we now call total war. The goal was to destroy the South's entire ability to keep fighting, crush their armies, yes, but also wreck their economy, their farms, their railroads, and break the will of the civilian population. This is what General Sherman's famous March to the Sea was all about. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was just completely collapsing. Lee's once invincible army was now starving, exhausted, and surrounded. The end finally came in a tiny courthouse town in Virginia.
The final meeting between Lee and Grant at Appomattox is just such a powerful image. You have Lee showing up in his absolute finest dress uniform, looking every bit the defeated but dignified gentleman. And then you have Grant, who arrives in his muddy, everyday field uniform, without even a sword. For Grant, this wasn't about ceremony, it was just about getting the job done and ending the killing.
And that really gets to Grant's mindset. He could have been harsh, but he wasn't. His terms were incredibly generous. He let Lee's men keep their horses so they could go home and plant their spring crops. He just had them turn in their rifles and sent them home. He knew the goal wasn't revenge. The goal was to start the unbelievably difficult process of stitching a shattered country back together. So when all was said and done, what was the final ledger? Well, the cost was just astronomical. Over 620,000 dead, an entire region's economy left in absolute ruins, and a nation with scars that would last for generations. But the outcome? The outcome was profound. The Union was saved, 4 million people were freed from the bonds of slavery, and soon the 13th Amendment would abolish the institution in America for good.
In the end, the war answered the two questions that had haunted the United States from its very beginning. Could this nation actually survive as one country, and would it survive with slavery? But in forging those answers in blood and fire, it left behind a legacy of bitterness and new challenges, and the long, hard struggle for freedom and true equality, well, that was really just beginning.